Hello, my friends. Europe is starting to realize too late, as usual, that the ground is shifting under its feet, that Washington is no longer behaving like the predictable guardian it pretended to be, and that Russia, by contrast, is playing a long game with a clarity and strategic discipline that the West has not matched for years. And I'm going to keep this direct and honest. The Western political class is now trapped between its own propaganda narratives, its economic weakness, and Russia's growing military leverage. What you're watching, whether in Berlin, Warsaw, Paris, or Brussels, is not confidence. It is adaptation under stress. Let me begin with something that should make everyone sit up and pay attention. Friedrich Merz has spoken about reconciliation with Russia twice in less than 30 seconds. Think about that for a moment. This is not a man who has been known for warm rhetoric toward Moscow. Quite the opposite. Up until recently, his tone toward Russia was hard, doctrinaire, and aligned with the broader post-2022 German political consensus. Moral condemnation, strategic rigidity, and a refusal to even entertain what reconciliation would mean in practice. So why the sudden shift? There are at least three plausible reasons, and they are not mutually exclusive. In fact, they can all be true at the same time. First, the condition of German industry. Germany is not going through good times. That is an understatement. Germany's industrial model, built on high-end manufacturing, powered by cheap, stable energy and predictable export markets, has taken repeated hits. Energy costs have risen. Supply chains have been disrupted. Demand is uncertain, and what makes Merz's setting important is that he delivered this speech at the Chamber of Industry and Commerce. That is not a random venue. It is a venue chosen for message discipline. He is signaling to the industrial and business class that he understands their anxieties and that he is willing to speak out loud. What many of them have been thinking privately for a long time: Germany cannot prosper indefinitely inside a European security arrangement that treats Russia as a permanent enemy, while simultaneously cutting itself off from the economic realities of geography, energy, and trade. Second, internal political pressure, especially from the AfD. Merz knows that if the establishment parties continue to cling to the same stale talking points while ordinary Germans feel economic pain, someone else will harvest the political benefit. The AfD has been one of the most effective political vehicles for channeling public frustration in Germany. Merz may not like the AfD, but he fears being outflanked by it. So, part of what you're watching is strategic adaptation. He is trying to absorb, neutralize, and repackage certain sentiments. Skepticism about endless confrontation with Russia. Skepticism about unconditional obedience to Brussels and Washington before the AfD converts them into electoral gains. Third, Donald Trump. This is the most recent and perhaps the most destabilizing factor, because Trump's behavior is forcing Europe to confront something it has avoided admitting. The United States is not a stable anchor. It is not a reliable architect of European security. It is a power with its own interests, sometimes aligned with Europe, sometimes not, and the moment Washington's internal politics shift, Europe finds itself exposed. Trump has made statements about Greenland, about international law, about power politics, and about how he intends to operate in a world where might makes right is spoken openly rather than hidden behind bureaucratic language. Merz is not blind. He sees that Europe is entering an era where American pressure could be applied not only against adversaries but also against allies. And that changes the calculus for any European leader who still thinks he can simply repeat NATO slogans and hope the storm passes. Now, the way this story was framed in the commentary you provided is revealing. It suggests that reconciliation with Russia is part of a longer conversation, one that implies security architectures in Europe, and it carries a gloomy undertone. That gloom is justified, because the reality is not pleasant for Europe. Europe has lived for decades inside an arrangement whose underlying doctrine goes back to the early Cold War. And here's the doctrine in its simplest, brutally honest form: keep the Russians out, keep the Germans down, keep the Americans in. Whether people want to admit it or not, this principle shaped the architecture of European security and, by extension, European politics. Russia remained outside the system, even when it sought integration. The United States remained the decisive external power inside the system, and Germany, despite its economic strength, was constrained strategically and psychologically, expected to follow, not to lead. That is precisely why Putin has been unhappy with the European security architecture throughout his presidency. He repeatedly signaled, especially in earlier years, that Russia wanted a security system that included Russia, not one built against Russia. He asked, at different points, whether Russia could join NATO or whether Europe could develop a comprehensive security framework that treated Russia as part of the continent's stability rather than its permanent threat. The West never answered seriously because the structure was never designed to include Russia. It was designed to manage Europe through an American lens. And now, when Merz says reconciliation, he is stepping into a space that the current European political class finds almost impossible to inhabit because they have spent years turning hostility toward Russia into a moral identity. You can't reverse that overnight without admitting that the last several years of rhetoric and policy were built on illusions. And that brings us to the lighthearted part that was introduced as a Friday diversion, but which actually reveals something darker about the political culture we're living in. We have this absurd spectacle involving Donald Trump and the Nobel Peace Prize medal of a Venezuelan opposition leader, Maria Corina Machado. According to the narrative presented, she gave Trump her Nobel medal, she praised his understanding of Venezuela, and Trump accepted it with both hands and called it a wonderful gesture of mutual respect. This is political theater of the most cynical kind. It is branding disguised as virtue. And what makes it grotesque is that the same Trump being praised for understanding Venezuela is the man whose administration, in 2017, imposed sector-wide sanctions aimed at Venezuela's oil industry, the main revenue source of the country. Whatever one thinks of Venezuela's internal politics, those sanctions were not a symbolic gesture. They were economic warfare. They were designed to squeeze the state by strangling its revenue stream. The claim that these policies help the Venezuelan people is one of the great lies of modern Western discourse. When you cut off a nation's main revenue source, you don't punish the regime in a vacuum. You punish the entire society. You punish ordinary people. And then you stage photo ops about suffering as if the suffering fell from the sky. Then we have another layer of cynicism. Just days earlier, Trump was reportedly dismissive of Machado's political standing, implying she lacked sufficient support or respect inside Venezuela. And what does a politician do when she is scorned by a powerful foreign patron? She tries to buy attention, buy legitimacy, buy proximity to power. So the medal becomes a tool, an object of influence used to repair a relationship. And then we get the inevitable public relations line, mutual respect. There is nothing mutual about it. This is the hierarchy of empire. Local actors seeking blessing from a foreign power that can make or break their future. Now, there's a claim embedded in all this. The Nobel Institute allegedly said the prize cannot be transferred. Fine. The title may not be transferable. But the medal is an object, and objects can be handed from one person to another. And the larger truth is that we are living in a political era where institutions pretend to hold moral authority while political actors treat moral symbols as currency. That is the real story. The medal, whether formally transferable or not, became a prop in a performance designed to manufacture legitimacy for both sides. From there, we move to Donald Tusk in Poland, reacting to Trump's remarks about Zelensky being reluctant to close a peace deal. Tusk says it was Russia, not Zelensky, who rejected the U.S. peace plan. This is a familiar European maneuver. When Trump criticizes Kyiv, European leaders rush to correct the record and to keep Trump psychologically aligned with Europe's preferred narrative. Because the Europeans are terrified of one thing above all else, that Trump might decide to negotiate around them, pressure Ukraine into concessions, or shift American priorities away from Europe's war agenda. But Tusk's statement raises an important technical point that gets buried. Which peace plan are we talking about? The initial 28-point version, or the amended version shaped in Geneva by US, European, and Ukrainian leaders? If the plan was amended and reshaped before it ever reached serious Russian consideration, then it's not accurate to speak as if Russia rejected the US plan as a fixed object. In reality, what Russia rejected was a version that did not suit Russian interests because Russia is winning on the battlefield and because Moscow does not bargain from weakness. That is the truth European leaders refuse to say out loud. Russia's rejection is not a tantrum, it is leverage. Russia believes time is on its side. And notice something else. Every time Trump says something critical of Zelensky, European leaders scramble. That is not because they love Zelensky, it is because they fear losing the United States. The entire European posture since 2022 has depended on US power, intelligence, logistics, weapons systems, diplomatic cover, financial depth. Without Washington, Europe's ability to sustain this confrontation collapses into its own limitations. So when Trump attacks Zelensky rhetorically, Europeans hear the deeper threat, I may not carry your war the way you want, and they panic. Now we get to a fascinating subplot, Germany's far right loosening its embrace of Trump. This is not just about Germany, it is happening across Europe. The pattern is the same. European parties that once looked at Trump and MAGA as a template for their own rise begin to realize that once Trump takes power, he does not behave like the symbol they sold to their voters. He behaves like an American president pursuing American interests, and those interests increasingly collide with European comfort zones. Threats over Greenland, the posture over Venezuela, the open contempt for international law, the rhetoric of conquest and imperial ambition, these things are politically toxic in European public opinion. So parties that align themselves with Trump now face a domestic problem. They must explain why their hero is acting like the very thing European history taught people to fear. This is why you see leaders making statements like, he violated the promise not to interfere in other countries. But the deeper irony is that Trump did not invent interference. The entire post-Cold War Western system has been built on interference. The difference is that Trump speaks the language openly. He strips away the polite bureaucratic mask, and that makes it harder for European political parties to sell alignment with him because the public can see the naked reality. America is not a moral project, it is a power project. Then the text returns to Merz's reconciliation with Russia comment, asking, if Russia is a European country, why has it been treated as permanently outside Europe? And here we come back to the NATO doctrine I mentioned earlier. Keep Russia out, keep America in, keep Germany down. That is the architecture. That is the logic. And it is precisely what Putin has challenged. In Russia's view, European security guarantees should not be made against Russia. They should be made with Russia. That's what a comprehensive security system would mean. But most European politicians today cannot even imagine that, because they built their careers on the opposite premise. Try to picture certain leaders. Tusk is a perfect example, suddenly reconciling with Russia. It does not compute, not because it is impossible in history, but because it is impossible inside their political identity. They would have to admit they were wrong, admit their policies failed, admit their rhetoric was reckless, and admit their dependence on Washington left Europe strategically infantilized. Now we shift to France and Macron, and here we see Europe's instinctive response to fear, symbolic displays of force designed to compensate for real dependency. Macron says France will send land, air, and sea assets to Greenland. He says France and Europeans must be present wherever their interests are threatened without escalation, but uncompromising on sovereignty. He says this while speaking at an airbase hosting nuclear-capable warplanes. The message is clear. He wants to project resolve and deterrence. He wants to signal to Trump, don't you dare. But this is where the move becomes dangerous and double-edged. Because deterrence only works when the actor has credible capability and credible willingness to escalate. If Trump is deterred, Macron can claim success. But if Trump is not deterred, if he pushes anyway, then Europe will look worse, not better. Because the confrontation will expose the reality of comparative power. It will reveal, brutally, who actually has global reach, who actually has the decisive tools, and who is performing for the cameras. Europe risks staging a show it cannot finish. Macron also criticizes what he calls a new colonialism and suggests Europeans have the means to be less dependent on the U.S. Then he throws in an astonishing claim that 2/3 of Ukraine's intelligence capabilities are now provided by France. Even if we treat the claim as rhetorical flourish, it reveals a deeper problem. Macron is trying to use Ukraine as a measuring stick for European autonomy, as if we provide intelligence to Ukraine equals we are independent from America. That is not how dependency works. Europe's dependency on the U.S. is structural. Energy deals, technology dependence, financial architecture, military systems, strategic lift, ISR networks, satellite dominance, and the entire NATO command framework. You don't escape that dependency by claiming you contribute more intelligence to Ukraine. And the irony is devastating. At the same time European leaders talk about independence, Europe signs enormous energy arrangements that deepen long-term reliance and lock in constraints. So the rhetoric becomes mind-boggling. Bold talk on one side, structural dependence on the other. Finally, we return to Ukraine itself, because in the end, all of this political theater is being shaped by battlefield reality. Zelensky declares an energy emergency in a cold snap amid intensified Russian strikes. Russia has massively increased pressure on Ukraine's energy infrastructure, and Ukraine's air defense systems are increasingly insufficient to deal with the scale and sophistication of the threat. The result is predictable: blackouts, emergency declarations, and a worsening humanitarian and economic crisis. People ask, Russia targeted energy infrastructure before, so why is the outcome worse now? There are two obvious explanations, and again, they can both be true at once. Russia is allocating more resources and more precision to this campaign, and Ukraine's ability to intercept and defend has degraded. It is that simple. So, let me tie the whole picture together in one line. What you are seeing in Europe, the sudden talk of reconciliation, the frantic narrative management, the panic responses to Trump, the symbolic deployments, the political parties scrambling to adjust, is the behavior of a continent that senses the old order is cracking. The United States is becoming more transactional and openly imperial in tone. Europe is too dependent to resist and too divided to act coherently. Ukraine is collapsing under the weight of Russian military power in the air and on the ground. And Russia, meanwhile, is operating with a clear strategic purpose: to reshape the European security architecture in a way that ends the era of NATO expansion and ends the fantasy that Europe can be built as a security system against Russia rather than with Russia. That is the real reconciliation question. And that is why Merz's words matter, not because they magically change reality, but because they reveal that even inside the German establishment, some people are starting to understand what the West should have understood years ago. This war does not end with slogans. It ends with power, geography, and the acceptance of facts.